The stone scraped on stone, a sound the valley had not heard in 100 years. It was the sound of a tomb opening, or a secret being told. Below Elara, 90 goats shifted and bleated, a tide of bone and bristle drawn to the dark, cool breath rising from the earth. They had done this. Their relentless, methodical chewing, their sharp little hooves, had scraped away the thistle and the dust of a forgotten age until the land gave up its ghost. A boy, Finn, stood beside her, his eyes wide as dinner plates. He held a shovel like a scepter, his knuckles white. The goats, he said, were just hungry. But Elara knew it was more than that. They were an engine of discovery, and they had just uncovered the lock to the valley's survival. She looked at the heavy flagstone they had levered up, at the dark square of promise yawning at their feet, and she thought of the $12 she had paid for this starving, ridiculous flock. She thought of the laughter in town, the pitying looks from men who knew better. They called her the goat woman of Barren Creek. They said she'd bought herself a patch of thistles and 90 ways to die. What they did not yet know was that hunger is a key, and sometimes the most broken things know best how to find the door. 6 months earlier, the laughter had been fresh. Elara stood in the dust of the livery yard, her hands tied in the folds of her skirt, while Silas Croft leaned against a hitching post, polishing an apple on his sleeve. He ran the town's mercantile, which meant he ran the town's debt, which meant he ran the town. He was a man whose warmth never reached his eyes. 90 head, he said, not even looking at the skeletal herd being chivied into a holding pen. The animals were a sorry sight, all ribs and matted coats, their eyes holding the dull terror of creatures who had walked too far on too little. From that drover who went bust up on the high mesa. A woman alone has no business with livestock, Elara, especially not these. They'll eat your cabin siding and die on your porch. He took a crisp bite of the apple. The sound was loud in the quiet judgment of the afternoon. Elara said nothing. She had learned early that arguing with a man like Croft was like trying to reason with a hailstorm. You just stood still and let it pass. She counted out the $12, coin by coin, into the drover's trembling hand. It was almost everything she had. The man wouldn't meet her eyes, ashamed of the state of his animals, ashamed of his failure. But $12 was more than the nothing he'd been offered for hides. For her, it was a chance. She had 5 acres of rock and thorn inherited from a great-uncle she'd never met. The land was considered a joke, good for nothing but breeding rattlesnakes and regret. But it was hers. And it was covered, fence to fence, in the one thing goats were said to love more than sin: thistle. The arithmetic was simple. She had a world of weeds, and now she had 90 hungry mouths to turn them into something else. Milk, meat, maybe even hope. As she and a hired boy began the slow work of herding the pitiful flock out of town, she heard Croft's voice drift after her, laced with amusement. "You'd have done better to sleep in the street, girl. It's a softer bed than the one you're making." She didn't look back. She just kept walking, her mind already on the slow, patient work ahead, the sun hot on her neck, the bleating of her broken flock, the only music she had. The first few weeks were a quiet, brutal rhythm of work. Before the sun crested the dry hills, Elara was up, hauling buckets of water from the sluggish creek at the bottom of her property. It was the only water source, and already in the spring, it was running low. This was the first part of her arithmetic. 90 goats, 2 buckets of water at a time, a quarter-mile walk each way. She counted the trips. She counted the gallons. She counted the days until the summer heat would surely bake the creek bed to a cracked mosaic of clay. The goats were too weak to browse far, so they huddled in the shade of the scrub oak that dotted her land, their heads hanging low. They were a flock of ghosts. The town's verdict echoed in the silence. A foolish woman. A fool's bargain. She ignored it. She spent her days grubbing out the worst of the burrs from their coats, checking their hooves for stones, speaking to them in a low, steady voice. She learned the particular character of her flock. There was a big, solemn billy with one crooked horn who acted as a reluctant sentry, a little nanny with ears like torn velvet who was always the first to the water trough. Slowly, methodically, she was learning their language, the subtle shifts in posture and sound that spoke of thirst or fear or contentment. Her hands, already calloused, grew rough as bark. At night, by the light of a single kerosene lamp, she read from a tattered copy of an almanac, studying sections on animal husbandry as if they were scripture. She learned about milk yields and breeding cycles and the deep, persistent nature of an animal built for scarcity. Her neighbor to the east was an old woman named Anya Petrova, who had come from a country of rock and snow. Anya watched her for a full month without a word, her face a road map of wrinkles, her eyes the color of a washed-out sky. One evening she appeared at Elara's fence line, holding a small covered pot. "You work like you are trying to bury a sorrow," Anya said. Her voice was thick with the accent of her homeland. She held out the pot. It was a stew, rich with herbs and the scent of wild onion. "But this is not how you bury sorrow. This is how you plant a future." Elara, startled, could only stammer her thanks. Anya nodded toward the goats. "Men here, they see land for what it is. Flat for corn, grass for cows. They look at your thistle and see failure. They do not know that the deepest roots find the deepest water. A thing is not worthless just because they do not know its worth." The words settled over Elara, a balm on the raw sting of the town's mockery. Anya pointed a bony finger at the big, one-horned billy. "That one. He is the king. You keep him strong, your flock is strong." From then on, Anya came by every few days, never staying long, but always leaving a piece of hard-won wisdom behind, like a smooth, gray stone. She taught Elara how to mix a mash of cornmeal and molasses to build the goat's strength, how to spot the first signs of bloat, how to read the sky for the promise of rain that never seemed to come. "Being right is its own kind of reply," Anya told her, "but it is a quiet one. You must be patient enough to hear it." By June, the change was visible. The goats' ribs were no longer starkly defined, and their coats had taken on a healthy sheen. They moved now not as a shuffling herd of invalids, but as a proper flock, flowing over the rocky landscape with a restless, purposeful energy. Their grazing had become a relentless campaign against the thistle. They started at the edges of the 5-acre plot and worked their way inward, clearing the thorny plants with an efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. What they left behind was not barren rock, but earth, dark and open to the sun for the first time in years. A boy from town, Finn, started appearing at the fence line after his chores were done. He was a scrawny, quiet child of about 10, with a shock of unruly hair and a habit of watching the world from under his brows, as if expecting a blow. The other boys mocked him for his stutter and his preference for solitude. He never said much, but he would stand for an hour at a time, watching the one-horned billy, whom he had secretly named General Jackson, marshal his troops across the thorny battlefield. One afternoon, Elara found him inside the fence, sitting on a rock, letting a young kid chew on his sleeve. She approached quietly so as not to startle him. "They like you," she said. Finn flushed and stammered, "They don't laugh." Elara nodded. "No, they don't." From that day on, he was her shadow. He had a surprising affinity for the animals, a gentle touch and a quiet patience that soothed them. He took it upon himself to name the entire flock, a task of immense and solemn importance. There was Patches and Old Man Hemlock, and a trio of identical nannies he called the Marys. His presence was a quiet comfort, a small alliance against the town's steady stream of disapproval. Together, they began the next phase of the arithmetic. With the goats growing stronger, the nannies began to produce milk. At first, it was a trickle, barely enough to fill a cup. But Elara was patient. She and Finn built a small milking stand from scrap lumber, and day by day the yield increased. She kept her success secret, banking it like a coal low under ash. In the cool of her small cabin, she learned the ancient art of cheese-making. She strained the rich, tangy milk through cheesecloth, pressed the curds, and salted the small white wheels. She laid them on shelves in the coolest corner of her cabin, turning them each day, watching as they developed a pale, creamy rind. The first time she tasted a finished cheese, a wedge of simple, fresh chev, the flavor was a revelation, bright, earthy, and alive. It tasted of sunshine and thistle and stubborn persistence. It was the taste of her land, a place everyone else had called worthless. It had worked. She held the proof in her hand. The town could laugh, but they were laughing at a ghost. The goat woman of Barren Creek had a secret, and it was growing, wheel by silent wheel, in the dark. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The sun beat down on the valley, bleaching the grass to the color of old bone. The creek on Elara's property slowed to a string of muddy pools, and she had to dig into the bed to find enough water for the goats. In town, the mood soured with the heat. The corn in the fields was stunted and withered, and the cattle belonging to the ranchers grew thin, their hides stretched tight over their skeletons. Men gathered at Croft's mercantile, their faces grim, their voices low and anxious. The talk was of selling off herds, of cutting losses, of mortgages coming due. Silas Croft moved among them with a practiced air of sympathy, offering credit and consolation, his ledger growing thicker with the town's desperation. He drove his wagon out to Elara's place one afternoon, pulling up in a cloud of dust. He didn't get down, just looked out over her property from his high seat. The change was undeniable. Where once had been a choked jungle of purple-flowered thistle, there was now a wide, cleared expanse of land. The goats, fat and content, grazed peacefully on the remaining patches. They were, without question, the healthiest livestock in the valley. Croft's eyes, however, were not on the goats. They were on the land itself. "I see you've been busy," he said, his voice smooth as butter. "Clearing this old plot. Surprising what a bit of work can do." Elara stood by the fence, her hands resting on a post, her face unreadable. She did not invite him in. She did not offer him a drink of water. She simply waited. "Still," he continued, "this heat is a killer. A woman alone. It's a hard thing. I've been thinking about your situation. I could take this land off your hands, give you a fair price, enough to get you a fresh start somewhere with a little more potential." He named a figure. It was an insult, barely more than what she'd paid for the goats. It was the kind of offer you make to someone you believe has no other choice. She met his gaze, her stillness a rebuke to his false warmth. "The land and I are doing just fine, Mr. Croft." A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before he masked it again with his smile. Stubbornness is a poor substitute for sense, Elara. When that creek of yours runs dry, and it will, don't come saying I didn't try to help." He clicked the reins and his wagon rolled away, leaving the scent of his cigar hanging in the hot, dry air. She watched him go, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. He hadn't been looking at the goats or the cleared land. He had been looking at her water. It was the only currency that would soon matter. That evening, Finn arrived with a long face. His father's small herd of cattle was suffering badly. "Pa says the deep wells in town are getting low," he whispered, stroking General Jackson's broad head. "He says if it doesn't rain soon, everything's lost." Elara looked at her own flock, their coats glossy in the fading light. They were browsers, not grazers, content with the tough leaves of the scrub oak and the last of the deep-rooted thistle. They were built for this. She had bet on the worthless thing, and the world was changing to make it worthy. The earth began to tell the story of the drought. Cracks appeared in the cleared ground, fine as hairs at first, then widening into fissures that a mouse could fall into. The world grew brittle. The sun was a hammer, and the sky was an anvil. What little grass remained was as crisp as paper. Elara and Finn spent their days moving the goats to the shadiest parts of the property, conserving their energy. The arithmetic had changed. It was no longer about thistle and milk, it was about water and time. Each bucket she hauled from the dwindling pools in the creek bed felt heavier than the last. She was in a race against the sun. One afternoon, while the goats were clustered near the foundation of the old, tumble-down smokehouse that had belonged to her great-uncle, she noticed something odd. The animals were not just seeking shade. They were scraping at the ground with their hooves, sniffing intently at a particular spot where the cracked earth seemed to form a perfect rectangle. General Jackson was the most insistent, pawing at the dirt, then looking back at her and letting out a low, guttural bleat. "What is it, boy?" she murmured, walking over. Finn followed, curious. The ground there was different, harder. She knelt, brushing away the loose, dry soil. Her fingers met not clay, but stone. A flat, dressed stone with a straight, clean edge. "Get the shovel," she said to Finn, her voice tight with a sudden, sharp excitement. They dug. The sun beat on their backs, but they didn't notice. The powdery dirt flew. Soon they uncovered the edge of another stone, and then another. It was a lintel, a massive, straight-edged block of granite that had no business being there. And beneath it, as they cleared more earth, they found them. 2 immense iron rings, rusted thick with age, set into 2 enormous wooden doors laid flat against the earth. A root cellar. But not just any root cellar. This one was built with a permanence and scale that spoke of a different time, a time of greater foresight and deeper pockets than her great-uncle had ever possessed. It took both their strengths, straining with the shovel as a lever, to lift one of the rings. With a great groan of protest from the rusted hinges, one of the heavy doors scraped open a few inches. A puff of air rose to meet them. It was not the foul, stagnant air of a tomb. It was cool, and it smelled of damp earth, of deep places, of water. Anya Petrova's words came back to her. The land remembers what the people forget. Elara and Finn looked at each other, their faces streaked with dirt, their eyes shining. Below their feet, hidden beneath the worthless thistle on the worthless land, a secret had been waiting. They had been scraping by on the surface, while all along an inheritance of coolness and shadow lay just beneath their feet. With the door propped open by a rock, they peered into the darkness. A set of steep stone steps led down into the earth. The air that breathed out was a physical presence, a relief from the scorching heat above. Elara lit a lantern, its yellow glow seeming small and fragile against the profound blackness. She took a deep breath and started down, Finn close behind her. The steps were slick with a fine, damp moss, cool to the touch. 10 steps down, 12, 15. They were deep underground now, the punishing sun a memory. At the bottom, they stood on a floor of packed earth. The lantern light pushed back the shadows to reveal a space larger than her entire cabin. The walls were lined with thick, perfectly fitted stones, sweating with condensation. Along the walls were shelves of heavy, dark wood, mostly empty, but on one, a row of glass jars sat coated in a century of dust. Preserves, pickled vegetables, things sealed away and forgotten. But that was not the greatest treasure. In the center of the cellar was a well. It was not a dug well, but a cistern, lined with the same expert stonework as the walls, capped with a heavy oak lid. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. She and Finn lifted the lid. The lantern light fell upon the surface of the water 10 feet below. It was still, black, and perfect. It wasn't just a cistern for catching rain. The stonework suggested it was fed by a deep, slow-moving spring, insulated from the drought-stricken world above by 20 feet of earth and rock. This was the deep water Anya had spoken of. This was the valley's memory. They lowered a bucket, and the splash echoed in the silent, cool space. When they hauled it up, the water was so cold it made Elara's teeth ache just to look at it. It was clear and sweet, the best water she had ever tasted. The arithmetic turned over once more in her mind, the numbers clicking into a new and astonishing configuration. She had water. Not just for a day or a week, but for as long as the spring flowed. She had food in the form of cheese aging on her shelves and goats who would not now go thirsty. She had a cool place to store it all, a fortress against the heat. She had everything the rest of the valley was losing. That evening, a man came through on his way to the city, a chef from a fancy hotel, his wagon having broken an axle a mile down the road. He was imperious and annoyed until Elara, taking pity, offered him water from the well and a piece of bread with her cheese. He stopped mid-complaint, his eyes widening as he tasted the chev. He held it on his tongue, his expression changing from irritation to astonishment. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. He wasn't asking about the town. He was asking about the cheese. He tasted the soil, the wild herbs, the unique terroir of her land in its flavor. Before he left the next morning, he made her an offer. He would buy every wheel of cheese she could produce, for a price that made her gasp. He paid her in advance for the first shipment, pressing more money into her hand than she had seen in her life. The town had called her the goat woman of Barren Creek. A city man with a refined palate had just called her an artist. News in a small town travels on the wind, and the chef's praise, coupled with the undeniable health of Elara's flock, shifted the currents of opinion. Mockery curdled into a grudging respect, and then, as the drought tightened its grip, into a sharp, painful envy. People who had laughed at her now watched her with narrowed eyes. They saw her goats, fat and placid. They saw that she was not hauling water from the dry creek anymore. They saw the faint greenness of the patch of earth around the old smokehouse, a testament to the cool, damp air rising from below. They started to whisper. How was she doing it? What secret was the quiet woman on the worthless land hiding? Silas Croft heard the whispers, and his greed gave them shape. He knew what a reliable source of water was worth in a dying valley. It was worth everything. He saw his chance not just to get her land, but to own the town's survival outright. He arrived one morning not in his wagon, but on his horse, a sheaf of papers in his hand. He did not bother with false warmth this time. His face was a mask of cold, procedural certainty. "Elara," he said, dismounting, "I hold the note on this land. Your great-uncle's dead. It's past due." It was a lie. She had the deed free and clear, a fact she knew he had already checked. "That's not true, Mr. Croft." "The county records say otherwise," he bluffed, tapping the papers. "And besides, there is a drought clause. Land that is not deemed productive during an emergency can be reclaimed for the public good. Your goats do not count as productive agriculture in the eyes of the territory." He was inventing laws, throwing dust in the air, hoping to confuse and intimidate her. He was counting on her being a woman alone, uneducated in the ways of men and their paper weapons. He saw her silence as weakness. He gestured around the parched landscape, a faint sneer on his lips. "The town needs a reliable water source, a central one, for the good of all. I am prepared to manage it. This is bigger than you and your pets." Fenn, who had been hiding behind the cabin, stepped out, his face pale with anger. "You leave her alone!" Croft barely glanced at him. His eyes were on Elara, his focus absolute. He took a step closer, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper. "There's no need for this to be unpleasant. Just sign the deed over. I will be generous. No one has to know you found that old well your uncle must have told you about. It was the slip, the fatal mistake. He had been so certain of her ignorance, so wrapped in his own cleverness, that he had overplayed his hand." Elara's gaze, which had been fixed on the dusty ground, rose to meet his. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the hot air like a shard of ice. "How did you know about the well, Mr. Croft?" The question hung in the air. Croft's face, for the first time, lost its composure. A dull red flush crept up his neck. He had been spying. He had been trespassing on her land in the night, drawn by the same clues that had puzzled the rest of the town, and his greed had led him right to the cellar door. His silence was a confession, more damning than any words. Behind him, on the road, 2 wagons had stopped. It was Fenn's father and another rancher, come to see Elara, perhaps to ask for water, perhaps just to see for themselves if the rumors were true. They had heard everything: the lie about the deed, the invented drought clause, the casual, cruel pressure, and now the admission of his snooping. Croft saw them and tried to recover, sputtering about public interest and his duties as a town leader. But the illusion was shattered. The respect he commanded was built on the careful management of debt and the perception of fairness. Now they saw him for what he was, a thief who would use their suffering as a lever to enrich himself. Fenn's father, a gaunt man with desperation in his eyes, walked past Croft as if he weren't there, and stopped before Elara. He took off his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough with thirst and shame. "My boy, he said you had water. My wife, my kids, we ain't had clean water in 3 days. My last 2 cows are dying. I don't have money, but I can work." This was the moment, the pivot upon which her entire future and the future of the valley would turn. She held all the power. She had the water, the food, the money from the chef. She could name any price. She could demand their deeds, their last animals, their pride. She could become Silas Croft, but with goats instead of a ledger. She looked at the man's cracked lips, at the hope and fear warring in his eyes. She looked at Croft, who was watching her with a new, calculating expression, already figuring out how to profit from her decision, whichever way it went. And she looked at Finn, who stood beside her, his trust in her absolute. She thought of Anya's words about planting a future. You do not plant a future with seeds of greed. You do not build a community on the foundations of another's desperation. Hunger changes a town, but generosity can change it back. She gave the rancher a small, steady smile. There will be no charge for water for your family, she said, her voice clear and strong. For your animals and for your neighbors, the price is this: 1 day's work for 1 week's water. Help me deepen the creek bed. Help me build a proper cistern for the town to use when the rains return. We will all get through this, or none of us will. A stunned silence fell over the small group. Finn's father stared at her, his mouth agape. Croft's face was a thundercloud of disbelief and fury. He had expected her to be greedy. He had been counting on it. A gouger could be understood, even dealt with. A generous person was a force he could not comprehend or control. It broke the rules of his world. The rancher finally found his voice. God bless you, ma'am, he choked out, tears welling in his eyes. He turned to Croft, his face hard with a farmer's righteous anger. And you? We'll be having a talk about our accounts at your store. All of us. Croft, seeing the tide turn so completely against him, mounted his horse without another word and rode off. A man shamed and exposed in front of the very people he sought to rule. He was not beaten by cleverness or by force, but by a simple act of kindness that had laid his own character bare for all to see. The word of Elara's offer spread through the valley faster than a prairie fire. By evening, a line of wagons was on the road to her property. But it was not a line of supplicants. It was a line of workers. Men arrived with shovels and picks, their wives with empty barrels and whatever food they had left to share. They came not to take, but to build. The work began the next morning. A quiet, determined army of her former mockers descended on her land, not as intruders, but as partners. They dug, they hauled rock, they timbered up the new cistern she had designed. They drank from her well and ate her cheese. And for the first time in months, the sound in the valley was not one of complaint or fear, but of shared labor and common purpose. Elara moved among them, no longer the strange goat woman, but their quiet, undisputed leader. She directed the work with a calm authority that no one questioned. She showed them how to line the new cistern with clay to hold the water, a technique she'd learned from Anya. She organized the families, ensuring the oldest and youngest had what they needed first. She refused to be one person alone against the town. Instead, she bound the town together, using her good fortune as the thread. In the evenings, the work crews would share a meal. The stories would start, and for the first time, Elara heard not laughter at her expense, but tales of their own foolishness. I said those goats would eat her house, one man admitted, shaking his head. Turns out they built one for all of us. Being right was its own reply, but seeing that rightness used for the good of all was a reply that echoed through the entire community. By the third week, the new town cistern was complete, a monument to their shared hardship and sudden hope. And then, one evening, the sky began to change. The brassy, endless blue was bruised with purple at the edges. The wind, which had for so long been a hot, dry breath, picked up, carrying the scent of ozone and distant, wet earth. Anya Petrova stood with Elara on the rise of the hill, watching the clouds gather. The land gives back what you give to it, the old woman said, her voice full of a quiet satisfaction. That night, the rain came. It started as a whisper, a few tentative drops tapping on the roof of the cabin. Then it grew into a steady, soaking downpour that drummed on the parched earth. All across the valley, people stood on their porches letting the cool, clean water run over their faces, a baptism after the long trial of the drought. The rain filled the creeks, soaked the fields, and began to trickle into the new cistern. Elara's secret well had saved them, but their shared labor had secured their future. The crisis was over, but the change it had wrought was permanent. Silas Croft's store was nearly empty as families began to barter and trade amongst themselves, rediscovering a wealth that couldn't be measured on a ledger. His power, built on the illusion of scarcity, had crumbled in the face of true abundance. Elara's farm became the new center of the community. Finn was her constant apprentice, learning the rhythms of the flock and the secrets of the cellar. The goats, authors of the entire affair, were local heroes. General Jackson was treated with a reverence usually reserved for the town mayor. Elara continued to make her cheese, which was now freighted to the city, bringing a steady stream of outside money into the valley's recovering economy. She never gloated. She never once said, "I told you so." Her vindication was not in words, but in the lowing of healthy cattle, in the green shoots of corn in the fields, and in the sound of her neighbor's laughter, free from the edge of desperation. One afternoon, months later, Anya found her sitting by the cellar doors, watching the goats graze on the new sweet grass that had grown where the thistle used to be. The land was healed. The people were healed. "The deepest roots find the deepest water," Anya said, repeating the words she had spoken so long ago. "You see now, a thing is not worthless just because a fool does not know its worth." Elara nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. She looked at her flock, at her land, at the solid roof of her cabin. She had paid $12 for 90 starving goats. In return, they had grazed open a history no one remembered and a future no one could have predicted. They had taught a whole valley the simple, profound arithmetic of hope.